Hi, I'm Brenda Chalfin. I'm the director of the Center for African Studies here at University of Florida. I want to welcome Julie Archambault from Concordia University, and I'm very pleased to have her here to share her most recent research with us. Professor Ben Suarez is going to give a more formal introduction before she starts her talk. Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brenda. It's really a great pleasure to welcome Julie Archambault, who is an associate professor of anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal. Julie received her PhD in anthropology from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And she has conducted extensive fieldwork, especially in Mozambique, for over the past 15 years. Much of her research focuses on the intersection of materiality and temporality, and more specifically on everyday engagement with such things as mobile phones, plants, cement, and more recently, sweat. Her book, Mobile Secrets, Youth, Intimacy, and the Politics of Pretense at Mozambique, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2017. Some notable recent publications since her monograph focus on the political and affective economies of concrete and body work, and on the histories of self-improvement in Mozambique. She is the second North African editor of the journal Africa, the journal of the International African Institute. I think that she is now in her third year doing what is incredibly difficult but important work for that journal. So it's really great that Julie is here with us today. It would have been better had she been here in person, but maybe we can arrange that sometime in the future. So thank you, Julie.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, Todd and Brenda and the Center for African Studies for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, albeit remotely. And yeah, I hope we'll get a chance to meet in person in the near future. I've been particularly looking forward to sharing my work with you today, especially because I've been engaging with the work of several members of the center, and so it's a really nice opportunity for me to kind of share my work with people that have actually helped me think through some of the material. And so I hope you can see my screen. I'm actually a very poor photographer, so I only have a few photos to share, but I'll start with this. And so my talk is on an ongoing research project on what I call the emerging workout ethic in Mozambique, a country where until quite recently, gyms and joggers were few and far between, and not many people would have considered exercising, let alone outdoors in public. And I know this because I've often been this lone jogger that people made fun of. But in recent years, exercising has become increasingly popular and incredibly visible on the urban landscape, especially just before sunrise and just around sunset, as fitness enthusiasts take to the streets. And among them are joggers, but also many people who gather in parks and roundabouts to exercise in small groups, as stairs are repurposed for sprints and squat jumps, and public benches for tricep dips. And it was around 2015 when the country was enjoying a wave of prosperity, albeit quite short-lived, following the discovery of oil and gas reserves in the north, that fitness really started taking off. And I say fitness, right, obviously, but the fitness boom, and I think we can call it that, and obviously Mozambique is not an exception to this phenomenon that we're seeing really across the continent, especially in urban centers. And there are obviously places with longer histories of exercising than others. But this boom has also coincided with an increase in sedentary lifestyles and changing diets, as well as with the so-called rise of the middle class in Africa. And I should say from the very beginning that certainly in Mozambique, the phenomenon transcends class in really important ways. And a good illustration of this is captured by this photo where you see, secondhand sellers specializing specifically in secondhand activewear. Across the world, the pursuit of fitness, which I understand as an aspirational pursuit driven by a combination of health and beauty concerns, has inspired alternative ways of working on and imagining the body. In addition to the perhaps more obvious ways in which fitness engages with fat, it has also encouraged new forms of engagement with sweat. In southern Mozambique, where class and gender have historically produced bodies that can accumulate fat and bodies that can avoid sweating, the growing popularity of fitness is complicating what we could call the cultural politics of bodily substances. Since I started this project in 2017, I've been jogging with middle-class Mozambicans along Maputo's Avenida Frederick Engels, taking group exercise classes in women-only fitness studio, training with a personal trainer at a more mainstream gym during the day, and doing outdoor boot camp classes, either in a quite wealthy part of the city, but also at a roundabout near the airport during rush hour evening traffic. This is just a bit of context. And while in the smaller city of Inhambane, I participated in aerobics classes in the city center, as well as in peri-urban neighborhoods, and also walked for miles briskly around the main running track with women determined to lose weight. And it was in these various sites that I started engaging with the materiality and fluid symbolism of sweat, that I started exploring the broader implications of the democratization of sweating. And so my focus today will be on the experiences of women I worked out with in the city of Inhambane. I'll sometimes also delve into some of the work I've done in Maputo. So sweat. Well, materially speaking, it's essentially water with more or less of a stink. It's clear, becomes almost invisible once it dries, and its olfactive qualities are relatively easy, let's say, neutralized. In other words, sweat is rather inconspicuous. And in my view, this makes sweat all the more interesting. As a bodily thing, sweat sits quite uncomfortably within post-humanist and neo-materialist efforts at decentering the human. But I argue that bodily substances, including sweat, and as things that straddle the subject-object dualism, can help refine understandings of the potentialities of matter. And so I propose to locate the transformative potential of changing ways of sweating and thinking about sweat at the intersection of sweat's material and semiotic qualities. So I'll start by situating sweat within the anthropology of bodily substances, reflecting on what sweat is and what it does. And then I'll briefly examine the cultural politics of sweat in Mozambique, where class, age, and gender tend to shape who sweats where and who can have others sweat for them, before turning to how an emerging workout ethic is redefining sweat and sweating in the city of Inhambane. So I hope to show how sweat operates simultaneously as a sign of transformation and as itself transformative by widening my ethnography of sweat to therapeutic and sexual sweat. And by exploring the different anti-sudorific techniques deployed to control sweat, I'll also attend to how the growing popularity of fitness actually reveals a profound commitment to prevalent hygienic ideals and practices, even if for some women in particular, this hygienic work cannot fully mitigate the transgressive implications of women, or at least certain women, sweating in public. And so sweat's rich symbolic repertoire is widely explored in the literature. And sweat has stood as anything from a visceral marker of class distinction to a byproduct of exploitation, to a key symbol of work ethic, and often as a substance with polysemous potential. Sweat works as a combination of all these things. But in anthropology, in contrast, there's been very little attention devoted to perspiration. And this is all the more striking given the discipline's long-standing and wide-ranging interest in bodily substances, from classic symbolic analyses to the anthropology of kinship and gender to new kinship studies. And a lot of this also, of this work emerges within Africanist literatures. So we can think of Victor Turner and his seminal work on Dembu ritual, who was among the first to highlight the symbolism of bodily substances, revealing how particular trees, plants, and color is central to initiation rituals, symbolize key bodily fluids such as blood, milk, and semen, and the matrilineage more broadly, and produced actions, as he put it. Departing from an understanding of kinship as the cultural construction of biological ties, so-called new kinship studies then turned more recently to the part played by various bodily substances in creating and shaping relatedness. Janet Carson, in her review article, provided quite an exhaustive list of such substances that somehow excluded sweat. If sweat has failed to make the cut, so to speak, it might be because, like tears, sweat is not related, and I'm paraphrasing Mary Douglas here, but sweat is not related to the bodily functions of digestion or procreation, and therefore seems to have a marginal ability of symbolizing social relations and social processes. It's perhaps also due to sweat's inconspicuous materiality, as I was suggesting earlier. However, when we consider the deep sociality of work parties, the claims of belonging developed through the toiling of the land, the friendships that are formed through collective suffering, whether on the battlefield or at the gym, and the intimacies crafted through the exchange of more than sexual bodily fluids, sweat's social and material relevance becomes evident. Sweat's importance in world making does in fact come across clearly in a few notable contributions to Africanist anthropology, and I'll just name two very briefly, but Belinda Strait's Samburu ethnography, which details how sweat participates in the crafting of relatedness among individuals, as well as across species. Also worth mentioning is Paulo Gaibazi's analysis of migration in the Gambia, which attends to how sweat is invested with moral value within an agrarian ethos that celebrates hard work, self-reliance, and sacrifice for others. Unlike other forms of bodily waste, which have received considerable attention through a focus on the politics of sanitation and waste management, and I'm thinking here of Brenda Chalfon's work, for example, sweat doesn't require an infrastructure of disposal. And unlike other bodily substances that are secreted from a specific orifice, it's also more difficult to contain. Perhaps it also seems pretty innocuous. But when sweat has generated interest, it's often been as matter out of place, generally bundled quite indiscriminately with other forms of dirt and bodily odors. As a potent interpretive category, dirt has operated as a visceral form of a class and racial distinction, and much has been written on the repressive hygienic regimes deployed in colonial contexts that were designed not only to keep the other, the colonized, clean, but also to create moral subjects. And in Mozambique, the Portuguese had a specific word for a katinga to describe the smell of Black bodies, which was considered to be distinct and repugnant. When reduced to a source of odor, however, we flatten sweat's materiality to single sensory dimension. So sweat might make bodies and hair smell, but it also makes bodies and hair look and feel differently. Sweat can betray when it reveals effort, like in Mitchell's account of the Kalela dance a long time ago in what was Northern Rhodesia at the time, where young women, and he called them, I think, nursing sisters, were tasked with wiping the sweat off the dancers' brows. Today, it's Pentecostal preachers who have their sweat mopped up during impassioned sermons, as sweat becomes entangled in new ways with the power to heal. And sweat can also either enhance intimacy through the exchange of more than bodily fluids or repulse when sweating bodies touch. As a substance that enlists multiple senses, that is, we could say, multisensorially apprehended, sweat holds great polysemous potential. And like other kinds of waste, it's also material that has effects in the world and that participates in shaping, as I hope to show, ways of becoming and relating. Now, if anthropology has neglected sweat in comparison to other bodily substances, the same can't be said of the wellness industry. So with the growing popularity of fitness, sweat has, over the last decade or so, been invested with new meaning. There's also an important gender dimension to these moral imaginaries, and it's women in particular who are encouraged to sweat and applauded for doing so. In North America, fitness became a mainstream pursuit in the 1980s with aerobics, which was designed to help women work on perfecting their bodies in line with mainstream ideals that prevailed at the time, while still looking feminine in the process. As fitness grew, Jane Fonda was fond of reminding her followers, women don't sweat, they glisten, whatever that means. But it was only more recently that as ideals of the female body shifted from skinny to strong, and as fitness became an end in itself rather than strictly as a form of weight control, that women were enthusiastically encouraged to sweat. And today, sweat, and here I'm talking about North America in particular, is conjured up by the fitness industry so candidly that it almost passes, it could easily pass unnoticed. The high-end fitness apparel retailer Lululemon markets activewear that promises to help us sweat more. The cycling app I use to train indoors during our cold Canadian winters counts my overall effort in drops of sweat that then become currency that I can exchange for cool gear for my cycling avatar. In fitness publications, sweat is even mentioned more frequently than fat. And I have a wonderful graduate student who went through the trouble of conducting content analysis of some of these publications. As the popular fitness and wellness magazine Women's Health put it, although once stigmatized, sweat has now become a badge of honor. Because of course, as they also put it, good things come to those who sweat. But now, how do the shifting moral imaginaries of sweat translate in Mozambique? So the pursuit of fitness rests on the idea that the fit body is a desirable body in a cultural setting in which fatness has more commonly been considered a mark of beauty, health, and wealth. In Mozambique, skinniness, especially in women, is commonly seen as a sign of lack of health, lack of social support, lack of sex appeal. And plump women, in contrast, are generally seen as well looked after and worthy of respect. Having said this, what I found was that the popularity of fitness was not so much a question of changing ideals of beauty, but rather about the adoption of new forms of body work, targeting ideals of beauty that have always been multiple. And I'd be happy to expand on this later. But what I also found, and this is what I want to focus on, was that my Mozambican interlocutors were not only liberal literate, to borrow an expression from Mark Graham, but also pseudo literate. That is, they were mindful of the politics of sweat, of how class, age, and gender tend to determine who is expected to carry out sweat-inducing activities and who can avoid sweating. For most Mozambicans, everyday life often already involves a significant amount of strenuous physical activity, whether in the form of paid labor, housework, or agricultural work. And although I heard echoes of sweat as the morally valued symbol of hard, honest work, the sweat produced through productive labor was one most would have ideally preferred to avoid. And this cultural aversion to sweat was for many far-reaching. So for example, Arsenio, a young civil servant, glossed over his lack of interest in fitness by stating that he simply did not like to sweat. He did, however, qualify his statement by adding with a flirtatious smile, well, except when I'm doing one thing. And I'll come back to sexual sweat later on. one often can, within the confines of the gender and generational division of labor, avoid sweating too much by performing demanding tasks at the crack of dawn, which is one of the most active moments of the day. Moving slowly is another good option, so it's trying to stay in the shade. Sweat's main biological function is, after all, thermoregulation. But not everyone has the power to escape physically demanding work or to engage in it when they please. And men often end up sweating more in public and women more in private, although there are plenty of women who also engage in strenuous labor outside of their homes. But with age and status usually come opportunities to outsource sweat-inducing activities. So you hire a maid to cook and clean for you. You get children to run errands. You find an air-conditioned office job. You get around by taxi. Maybe one day you buy a car. In short, how and how much one perspires tends to be tied to class, age, and gender, or at least it was so until recently. Now, the practice of physical activity in Mozambique is, of course, not new. But fitness as a pursuit driven by a combination of health and aesthetic concern is a novel interest. I always give the example of this 60-something very fit woman who told me, you know, I've been interested in exercising since I was young, but it's only now that I call it fitness. And it was in the city of Inhambane, which is a rather sleepy provincial capital of about 80,000 inhabitants, located on the Indian Ocean on the coast, about 300 miles from north of Maputo, the capital, that I first noticed this new trend. Until recently, as I said in the introduction, it was mainly expatriates and tourists who would visibly exercise in public, but this started changing around 2015. And Inhambane arguably lies on the periphery of the fitness craze, but in a sense, in my view anyways, that's one of the things that makes it all the more interesting. It's also the city where I've been conducting research for nearly 20 years. And Inhambane is quite a particular place. It was a settler town during the colonial period, and was home also to a disproportionately high number of assimilados, Africans who were granted a privileged status by the Portuguese. And owing in part to this colonial legacy, Inhambane residents have developed a certain sense of superiority. I often heard people describe themselves as being the most civilized Mozambicans, for example. The city even prides itself on being the cleanest in the country, a prize it receives every year. And I've explored elsewhere the local politics of pretense, whereby everyday life is carefully curated to maintain appearances. And I've seen some of the concerns informing these practices surface as women take to public spaces to exercise. So Inhambane has a well-maintained running track that offers stunning views of the bay ever since Cyclone Dineo destroyed the concrete wall that used to run the perimeter. During the day, the space is regularly used by school children for, well, quite reluctantly most of the time for physical education classes. Whereas in the early mornings and evenings, it attracts an older crowd. Some run or speed walk around the track while others exercise on the polished concrete stage by the entrance. And so this is really the city's main outdoor fitness site. And when I started this project a few years ago, I joined a group of a dozen women in their 50s and 60s who trained every weekday evening with a young university student named Pedro. They were euphemistically described as mamães, which translates as mothers, but can also, as in this case, suggest women who are on the larger side. And they paid a monthly fee of about $3, which is a relatively modest sum for these women who all lived in the city center in concrete houses, and either worked or had a husband who worked for the state or was, well employed. They spoke Portuguese among themselves, the official language of the country, and most were either from assimilado families or of mixed ancestry. Most also self-identified as middle class, though with some hesitation, as a proper middle class person shouldn't have to exercise outside in public. But at the time, there were no alternative. Pedro's classes varied greatly in style and content. Sometimes we spent the better part of the hour doing floor exercises on stinky mats under the dim lighting of the nearby street lamps. Pedro often got us to do sets of old school sit-ups, working in pairs, holding each other's ankles in turn. Sweat made our grip slip, but still everyone agreed this was the best way to reduce the stomach, one of the group's main shared objectives. Sometimes we played shark tag, or a version of handball without goals. And the woman would shout, "Agora está animar," which means, oh, now it's really fun. Every now and then throughout the workout, especially during the most challenging exercises. And at the end of each class, following the stretching routine, we would all huddle together. This was before COVID, obviously. And Pedro would ask how we were feeling. And this was an opportunity to praise and thank the faithful instructor, who was respectfully referred to as Mister in English. On Fridays, Pedro would take the group on a brisk walk around the city, and most of the women enjoyed the walk, which they would intersperse with the occasional sprint. But several were uncomfortable with being seen exercising so publicly and preferred to give the Friday classes a miss. On a subsequent field trip last year, I trained with a pair of younger women who lived in one of the city's popular neighborhoods, a good 20-minute walk from the city center and from the track. They were both in the early 30s when I met them, and while Amanda had a husband with a stable job, Katrina was single and her living conditions a bit more precarious. On weekday evenings, they'd walk around the track as many times as possible while waiting for Sancho. And it was he, a young man from the neighborhood, who had encouraged the two friends to start exercising, even volunteering these informal aerobics classes after work. I'll show you. Oh, this is, yeah, a photo of, well, sometimes other women from the neighborhood would also join us. And although these two groups of women came from really quite significantly different backgrounds and generations, they shared a desire to become fitter, to look and feel good, or at least better. Several had developed an interest in fitness after being diagnosed with an obesity-related health issue, and most had been encouraged either by a doctor or a friend to start exercising. And although they were all concerned with their waistline, I also heard many speak in more general terms of wanting to maintain their organism, a healthy organism. Their pursuit of fitness was, in other words, driven by a combination of health and beauty objectives, and perspiration played a central role in how these objectives were articulated and addressed. So in many parts of the world, perspiration is induced therapeutically to combat illness and to restore health and well-being. And in southern Mozambique in particular, steam baths with eucalyptus or other leaves are used quite regularly to relieve symptoms of colds and flu and to treat several other diseases. Raul, a young traditional healer I interviewed, described sweat as a good barometer of a person's health, provided one knew how to interpret it. So whether it was read as a sign of health, illness, or guilt, or as evidence of effort, the polyinterpretability of sweat was closely tied to the ways in which sweat's fluid materiality renders underlying processes visible, or olfactable, and sometimes also touchable, palpable. It's also this fluid materiality that shapes sweat's cleansing efficacy, as it helps purify other bodily substances, such as blood, through the excretion of toxins and other flow-impeding impurities. Sweat thus denotes more than it connotes, in the sense that it's a sign of something more than it conveys any kind of additional meaning. And the women I worked out with used a similar language when describing the benefits of exercise-induced perspiration. A good workout was one that made one sweat a lot, and fitness instructors were evaluated on this criteria. Sweat, in other words, was seen as a gauge, as a way of ascertaining that a workout was having a transformative impact on the body. For example, Katerina once complained that the workout with Sancho had been too easy. And to prove her point, she asked me, she said, just touch my back, you'll see it's not even wet. And Sancho, I think, was a bit insulted, challenged Katerina's assessment by blaming the strong breeze that was blowing that evening. Still, Katerina was left unsatisfied. And when we texted each other good night that evening, she told me she had done a series of sit-ups on her veranda after arriving home. But sweat was also more than a sign. It was itself essential to the desired transformation. The more you sweat, the more you eliminate toxins, the women told me. Toxins, one of them explained, are acids that trap fat inside the body. That's why you need to sweat. Sweating is healthy, they agreed. And if they saw everyday sweat as a source of nuisance, they considered sweating while working out essential to the attainment of their health and aesthetic goals. My friend Katerina went further by toying with this semantic slippage afforded by the Portuguese language between calor and calorias. So calor means heat, but it can also mean sweat, and calorias, well, means calories, right? And so Katerina liked to say that she wanted to see the calorias leave her body with the calor, with the sweat, with the heat. For fitness enthusiasts like for healers, the complex entanglement between sweat and impurities was such that sweating was simultaneously a means to transform the body and evidence that this transformation was underway. The women I worked out with were also strong believers in the weight loss benefits of localized sweating. Several of the middle-aged women who took Pedro's classes liked to wrap themselves up in plastic bags to sweat as much as possible. And some of the more affluent gym goers in Maputo preferred to cinch their waist with a neoprene belt, purposefully designed to increase localized sweating and weight loss. One of them recommended a special coconut cream, sweat cream that worked miracles according to her. And she opened her Amazon app on her phone to show me the exact brand. And her basket was full of sweat-inducing creams and contraptions that her husband, who was away in the US at the time, would be coming back with at the end of the month. Even sexual sweat was discussed in strikingly similar ways. So just to illustrate, reporting back on a brief affair with a French tourist, my friend Anna complained that the sex had been rather average. And the problem, she explained, was that the man had insisted on keeping the air conditioning on all night, and that they never managed to generate, well, she said, o calor que anima, the heat, the sweat that is pleasurable. Or consider a comment made by a university student discussing sexual pleasure with some of her classmates. And she said, and the others agreed, sorry, she said, you know, if I'm not sweating, it's clearly because you haven't done anything to me. So in other words, sweat was simultaneously integral to and evidence of mutual enjoyment. The last time I went to Mozambique was, well, last year during a particularly hot February, before the end of the world as we knew it. And many were complaining about the heat. And so one day I decided to treat myself to a day off, and I went to the beach. And that's where I met this charming beach boy who tried very hard to seduce me. But he eventually gave up when even his offer of an air-conditioned room failed to sway me. He said, "My room has AC." Really the best, most memorable pickup line I'd ever heard. But so air conditioning is a rare resource that can be used to denote privilege and to entice clients, perhaps even lovers, although many of the women would disagree perhaps. But the air-conditioned office job was already a prevailing aspiration among the young men and women I followed as early as the early 2000s, an aspiration that ties into the cultural politics of sweat that I was detailing earlier, whereby the socially mobile can seize opportunities to avoid sweating. And so although the consensus among fitness enthusiasts was that sweating was normal and healthy, sweat was nonetheless also seen as an irritant. And my friends relied on, like many others, on anti-sudorific techniques and technologies to control their sweat and to allay body odor. I heard many also reflect on the kinds of clothes and colors that better concealed sweat. So polyester was seen as a good option for mitigating the visible signs of otherwise unsightly perspiration, but with the downside of exacerbating its olfactive qualities. And my Mozambican interlocutors also had recourse to various techniques to avoid being in contact with other people's sweat. They commonly mentioned the overcrowded minibus taxis that most people rely on to get around the city as the epitome of unwanted exposure. Most importantly, everyone was expected to bathe regularly, ideally twice a day, and properly. Tomar banho, como deve ser, in Portuguese. As a form of waste, sweat is not only a byproduct of workouts, but one that also requires its own hygienic work. And if the sweat produced by underemployed young men and by wives, daughters, and daughters-in-law engaged in domestic work ranked differently on the moral spectrum of ethical work from the sweat excreted by fitness enthusiasts, at the end of the day, sweat is sweat, as a young woman put it to me. And it has to be carefully cleansed. Having a bit of technical difficulty. All right, so sorry about that. Bathing in Mozambique, in fact, has often been described as more than just a hygienic practice. I've heard people over the years repeat that it's actually part of our culture in reference to this important everyday ritual. So before leaving Inhambane, the last time I was there, I invited Katerina and Amanda to a goodbye dinner at a restaurant in the city center. And I suggested we either skip the day's workout, not an option, they responded, or go right after Sancho's class to save them from having to go back home for a shower and then back into town. All sweaty, they asked, by way of refusing this plan as well. Katerina, who only owned one set of exercise clothes she had purchased secondhand, had also adopted a stringent laundry routine. So she would arrive home from her workout and throw her gear in a basin with water and a spoonful of Omo washing powder, leaving the mixture to sit while she had dinner. She needed to have the outfit washed and hung to dry before going to bed if she wanted to be able to wear it again the following day. Another young man who gave exercise classes in Maputo, where activewear is more easily accessible, had assigned specific colors to different days of the week. Blue t-shirts on Mondays, red ones on Tuesdays, he told me, to make sure that nobody wears the same sweaty gear 2 days in a row. So accompanying changing moral imaginaries of sweat was in fact a profound commitment to prevalent hygienic ideals and practices. For some of the women I worked out with, this hygienic work was, however, not sufficient to mitigate the transgression of exercising in public. So many also tried to be as inconspicuous about their workout as possible. If women from privileged background were likely to have more opportunities to avoid sweat-inducing activities, ultimately what they possessed was a higher level of control over their sweat. And so the image of a middle-class woman dressed in the latest fitness apparel, driving to the gym, that wasn't, particularly problematic. And Mozambicans have been exposed, especially through telenovelas, to these sorts of practices for years. But for the less privileged women, sweating in public by choice was strange, especially in Inhambane. Unlike in Maputo, where fitness enthusiasts could often be seen proudly parading in fashionable exercise gear, fitness in Inhambane remained a marginal pursuit that had little conspicuous about it. Much of it took place in near darkness under a street lamp or before sunrise, and only a lucky few had workout clothes worth showing off. So in 2020, I joined a third group of women who met quite unfortunately, at 4:30 a.m. every other weekday morning to exercise on one of the recently paved roads in this peri-urban neighborhood, actually not too far from Katerina's house. And the very early start suited those who had to make it to work by 7. For Tanya, a 60-something woman who sold charcoal at the market, the appeal also lay in the level of privacy granted by exercising while the city was still asleep. She had originally started training at the track in the early evenings, only to be teased by people in the neighborhood, some even raising questions about her faithfulness to her husband. "Where are you going like that? Who are you trying to look sexy for?" she recalled him saying. So somewhat perturbed, but undeterred, Tanya had adapted her workout routine, which in the end suited her fine, while also shielding her from unwanted attention. Others insisted that they were, in their words, not scared of sweating. And the language they used was significant. If generally speaking, not being scared of something serves to emphasize a willingness to engage in an activity or a task that would normally disrupt class or gender expectation. So a transgression of propriety, yet one yielding outcomes that could be morally valued. So another example would be young men saying they're not scared of engaging in domestic chores, for example. But this wasn't a sentiment shared by everyone, hence the high absenteeism at the Friday evening walks around across the city. Aware of this preoccupation with discretion that self-deprecating Inhambane residents saw as a distinguishing feature of their identity, Pedro dreamt of one day moving his classes to an indoor venue. Other fitness trainers in Inhambane expressed similar ambitions, convinced that more people would join if they could train in a private setting. If sweating was understood to promote good health and weight loss, simultaneously contributing to and signifying bodily transformation, it was also transformative in other ways, as this inconspicuous perspiration fostered alternative ways of becoming and relating. Looking at the transformative impact of fitness on the lives of women like Katerina really helps to put this point forward. So Katerina cultivated new ways of using her time. As a single woman and part-time entrepreneur who spent most of her time at home, her weekdays were reframed by the anticipation of her late afternoon workouts. She also developed new ways of moving around the city and confidently using certain urban spaces that she would not have had access to otherwise. So in Inhambane, where women's opportunities to socialize are really quite limited and often confined to the home or the church, the pursuit of fitness has enhanced women's access to the city. And having committed to an active lifestyle, Katerina was also more careful about her sexual health. After devoting all these evenings to becoming healthier, I'm not then going to jeopardize my health by not using protection, as she confided on one of our laps around the track. The growing popularity of exercising has also created new social relations. So like the fat body, the fit body is also relationally produced through networks of care. And as some of the examples I've presented here highlight, some of these are really quite beautiful intergenerational relationships, bringing together young male instructors and older female participants. In contrast to the mythical brothers who are born through the exchange of blood brothers who are born through the exchange of blood, what is shared here is arguably more the suffering and the aspiration than the sweat. Than the actual sweat, but the damp ankles that one holds on to in paired sit-ups, the plastic bags one helps adjust, and the beads of sweat that one notices all participate in the democratization of sweating. Although the redefinition of moral imaginaries of sweat may seem at first somewhat trivial, and I have to admit that this was also my impression at the beginning, and Mozambique, certainly the idea that it is acceptable, encouraged even for women to sweat is actually really quite radical. In a place where class and gender have produced sweating bodies entangled in hierarchies of care and labor, the growing popularity of fitness has inspired women to start using and thinking about their bodies differently and to embrace an emerging workout ethic generative of new ways of becoming and relating. So in the title of the talk, I invoke the multiple meanings of motion. Motion first as the action or process of moving and being moved. And so I'm referring here to the ways in which the new ways of moving that women are experimenting with, as well as the transformative potential of these new practices. But motion also refers to a proposal calling for change. And in this case, I mean the women's proposal, the sweaty motion to use and think about their bodies in the city in different ways. Invested with new meaning, sweat and sweating, and I'm concluding here, are embedded in political and affective economies that are themselves undergoing transformation, and in ways that are, I think, indissociable from sweat's fluid symbolism and inconspicuous materiality. Like other things, sweat's efficacy lies in the recursive feedback loops between science and the body that Sasha Newell so aptly describes in his recent critique of the what he calls the anti-semiotic stance that is prevalent in certain strands of neo-materialist scholarship. And so I think an ethnographic focus on sweat can indeed help us better understand a variety of human experiences. And this is another fun fact about sweat, actually, especially considering that no other species sweats as much as we humans do. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, we have about 40 minutes for questions and comments from the room, so I will call on you when I see a hand. Well, I'll lead off with one then. Can you talk a bit more about, you mentioned intergenerational networks between instructors and women who are going to their classes. What about this kind of social networks between women themselves? And do you see those producing sort of new or different kinds of networks?
I would say yes. So I would say new friendships are formed, and also new opportunity to kind of develop these friendships, right? And so one kind of key dimension, I think, to all these practices is precisely the ways in which they're also a crucial form of entertainment, and I situate this kind of emergence within longer histories of the study of sports in Africa, where this was always a key feature, right? Highlighted by scholars, historians, social historians who are interested in these longer histories. And so in this case, there's a very kind of important side to how the fitness groups, especially if they center around more semi-formal forms of exercise classes, also serve as a form of social support, right? So if a member falls ill or on birthdays, usually cake is shared, which seems contradictory, but somehow is not. And so there's a lot that centers around the associative nature of these groups and networks in ways that perhaps echo or replace to some extent more associative roles that were not very long ago taken over by church associations or groups and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. I see Ben has a question or comment. Go ahead, Ben.
Yes, so I really enjoyed that, Julie. I wonder if you could elaborate on this critique that you mentioned from Sasha Newell toward the end. I think if you could, tell us more explicitly how your material is engaging with those debates.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so in the longer paper, which is more targeted to an anthropological audience than an Africanist multidisciplinary audience, this is the argument that I'm trying to make. And so suggesting that, so what Sasha Newell is saying really is he's critiquing the ways in which new materialist scholars are overlooking, and this is his reading, right, but overlooking semiotics, or have kind of dismissed semiotics as, not as relevant as a focus on the hard materiality of matter, of things, right? And so in a sense, what I'm trying to do in the paper is draw our attention to how the materiality of sweat, right, which I've described as really quite inconspicuous, and the symbolic kind of registers of sweat, which I describe as fluid, intersect, and in a way that could not be, in a way that is crucial to the actual understanding of the potential that new ways of sweating and sweat itself have in on people's social relations and just ways of being and relating in general, right? So in a sense, bodily substances are not the kind of matter that no materialist scholars are really interested in, because they occupy this weird space where they're human, but they're matter at the same time. And what I'm trying to, argue in the paper is precisely how well that makes them particularly interesting to understand these intersections, right? And thinking about semiotics as, this evil kind of framework that needs to be replaced by, pure materialist thinking, deprives us of, really rich material. And in emphasizing how, when we look at just fitness sweat, but sexual sweat, therapeutic sweat, there's really a clear emphasis on how sweat is both symbol of something, but is also the matter that renders transformation possible, right? So it signifies transformation, but it's also the thing that brings the transformation. And I don't think this would apply to every bodily substance, but certainly sweat is this kind of, well, I think this special bodily substance that allows us maybe to think about the potentiality of matter in ways that are certainly not anti-semiotic, let's say, as Neil would put it.
Yeah, so thanks. If I could just do a follow-up, if Todd will permit.
Of course.
So, I mean, it really, listening to your paper, it really is striking that anthropologists for decades have had so much to say about bodily substances. Why have they ignored sweat? I mean, there's so much about, blood and sperm and breast milk. And yeah, why has sweat been ignored? I mean, it's really quite glaring after listening to your paper.
Yeah, it's fortunate for me because I can explore this oversight. And when in the paper, I'm also kind of trying to answer this why question, because it's been intriguing. It's been intriguing me from the very beginning. And that's the thing. Sweat really is just water, basically. It's not involved. And this Mary Douglas, said a long time ago. So she recognized that bodily waste had this dangerous potential, right? And sweat is included in this perspective. But she had a lot to say, not a lot to say, but she had, this is Douglas, she had things to say about tears, right? And one of the the rationale behind her lack of interest in tears was that they weren't involved in procreation or digestion or the things that matter socially, right? And so I think sweat and tears have also been overlooked for a number of reasons. And yeah, really quite strangely so. Especially in literature, sweat emerges all the time. And once you start kind of paying attention to the kind of absence or the presence of sweat as a symbol of so many other things, it really becomes even more glaring, I would say.
Great, thank you. You have another question or comment from Matthew. Go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, yeah, it was a really great talk. Thank you. I apologize if I missed some of this, but I was just curious. You mentioned that kind of the fitness boom, I think you referred to it. I was just wondering, from, traveling a lot and working abroad and stuff, I always notice there's kind of like global trends.
Mhm.
And so I feel like everywhere you go in the world now, there's like gyms and other trends with yoga and stuff. Were there any like sort of more endemic like fitness things that they were into? I mean, I guess probably like soccer or football is pretty big in Mozambique, but were they more looking at like, I don't know, South African trends for fitness, or Europe or Asia, or what? Or did they also combine it with like, I don't know, some kind of dancing thing, cultural thing, endemically, or what?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So I would say what's fashionable kind of changes and travels through certain channels that are really quite well established in southern Mozambique. So South Africa is a great source of inspiration, and it's long been, through migrant labor networks. So migrants to South Africa would come back with, various ideas and practices and ways of speaking, linguistic practices, disease as well. And this is certainly, still the case in terms of just fitness information. So one of the interesting people I worked with, a young man who had just started an online fitness magazine, actually towards the start of this project. And he was very proud of producing Mozambican content for Mozambicans. But then he told me how, he had been to South Africa to train as a personal trainer. And then he had come back with literally a case of fitness magazines he was able to purchase in South Africa as, information, right? And then there's Brazil also, Portugal to some extent, but Brazil is also a really important source of information. And so some of the instructors I worked with, spoke of how they were very much engaged in, teaching themselves various exercises by watching YouTube videos, and Brazil was a source of these videos that came up quite frequently in conversations. But then I suppose I wanted to point out another thing. There's also this other really fascinating phenomenon that I haven't started writing about yet, but it's like the global traveling personal trainer, right? So I don't know if you're old enough to remember when, North Americans would, travel to teach English in Thailand, or now I'm starting to see there are personal trainers who are just traveling in a very similar kind of way and offering their services as personal trainers, right? So they'll have a certain client base that's online and that they can work with irrespective of where they find themselves. But then, some of these traveling personal trainers I met in Mozambique, would spend, a few months hanging out in Maputo, and then they'd have local clients as well as their, international base of clients. And so these are, interesting trends. And let's also recognize that the wellness industry, which obviously includes fitness, it's like a multi-trillion-dollar industry. It's a force, I think, to reckon with, and showing no sign of decline, right? So it's also interesting to see, and I'm going to do more field work in the next few months in December, but it's also interesting to see the impact that COVID is having on some of these practices. And with gyms closing in Maputo, for example, it's almost like the outdoor fitness has become even more popular, and people had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, and so this also added to the uptake of fitness. as, again, and this is something I really want to emphasize, as a practice that seriously transcends. It's not a middle class thing, right? Of course, middle class is central to understanding the appeal of the growing appeal of fitness, but it's much broader in terms of phenomenon. And certainly I can only speak about what's going on in Mozambique, really, but yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, looks like we have another question or comment from Joan. Joan, I'm moving you over to panelist, so you should be able to turn your video on if you wish.
Oops. I'm trying to put my video on here, but I can't for some reason. Thank you so much. It's so interesting. I didn't want to be the obvious one as a person who does research in dance and performance to ask this question. There I am. But since you had mentioned, I think in answer to Todd's question, you had mentioned something about the notion of entertainment in the sense of this sort of space of entertainment. I was just wondering what role music plays in these engagements. Obviously, maybe not when they're doing the walk through the city, I guess, but in these, group meetings of women, the role of music, the sort of music that gets selected, what's considered popular if it's there, and how that may or may not be seen as something that enhances the engagement, and why that may be or not.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I have to admit, I haven't given really much thought to this. And so this is probably something I'd have to look into more closely. What I can say is most of the time music will be played, but it usually comes from someone's cell phone, right? So it's meant to accompany the workout, and I'm not sure what kind of process goes into selecting the songs that are played and how these playlists are curated. So I can't pretend to know anything more about that. But often the music it's barely audible in some cases, right? Or it's or there's a cacophony also because there'll be several groups individually training in different sites that are often quite close together. But yeah, I'd have to look more into this to offer a better answer to your question.
Thank you. And I don't know if others have questions, but I had sort of a related one.
Go ahead, Joan.
If I may. Thank you, Todd. I was just wondering how a sort of a sense of a language of movement, if you've seen anything begin to develop in terms of maybe a group that you've been with over time, because in the sense of how people would approach movement, if there is something there that considers some sort of phrasing that you see that helps the participants or the teacher together with the participants make meaning of the event in a particular way, which of course gets closer to a sense of, entrainment or people, engaged, if you will, as a unit performing something, if this rings any bells in terms of what you've observed.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and obviously there's all vocabulary, right? So one that new fitness enthusiasts have to learn in order to participate in the classes, right? Because you're being shown what to do, but you're also being told what to do, and it takes some time to cultivate this vocabulary, this language. But there's also one thing that has struck me as worth exploring further, and it's really the kind of deferential relationship between students and teachers, right, or instructors or personal trainers, and a kind of a very, I would say, deferential relationship, respectful relationship, but one where it's almost military in style, right? So there's not so much the tone, but the respect. So it would be very uncommon for someone to challenge what they're being asked or told to perform, right? Even if maybe it seems like excessive or painful, or and so that for me is interesting in terms of just the kind of aesthetics of the practice, right? And the ways in which and this connects a bit with my earlier work, where I was interested in people's engagement with information and just information control, and how there was a kind of clear understanding that nothing could be taken at face value, and then people were always so skeptical of everything, really, but to the extreme, right, almost. And how suddenly this skepticism towards information really dissipates when it comes to fitness information. And so this is also something I'm interested in exploring further. And I'm kind of curious to better understand the hierarchies that are formed through these fitness mentorships, if we could call them that, and how they relate to maybe other institutions of mentorship and relationships with godmothers, godfathers, and that sort of stuff.
Very good, thank you. Sounds like gender would be one.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
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 Thank you so much, Julie. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your question.
Okay, I see a question from Latiwe. I'm moving you over to panelist, so you should be able to turn on your video if you wish in a moment.
Thank you so much, Todd.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Prof, for your insightful presentation. Sorry, I joined late because of our time differences. I just want to find out, I might have missed this, so I apologize. I just want to find out what is the motivation to focus only on Mozambique. And also, I think it will also be interesting to conduct a similar study in other regions, because there might be different temperatures. So you might, there might be similarities in terms of the results that you get, but I don't know. And also, I just want to find out, in terms of the sweat in Mozambique, did you also take into account the diet, the type of food that is being eaten that side? Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. So why only Mozambique? Because I'm an anthropologist and I like to do kind of extensive long-term field research in one single, actually now I'm working in two sites, but two sites in Mozambique, to really get a sense of the deep sociality involved in these practices. But I've actually submitted a grant application which would offer how the project is framed. It's really pushing some of the themes I've been exploring in this current project a bit further, to think about the articulation between health and beauty and different practices that play on this intersection in other parts of Africa, right? So looking at building a team of scholars who would be exploring these dynamics in other parts of the continent. But I'm still interested in a kind of Africa focused perspective. And in terms of diet, this is something I haven't started looking at yet, but it's on the cards, right? I'm interested in working with colleagues, Mozambican colleagues who've been working on health food stores in Maputo. And of course, diet comes up in conversations, right? So I do have some material on this, and I spend a lot of time eating with people, and I have for many years now. So I do have some information, right? But I haven't started doing kind of more systematic ethnographic research on diet. I'm also interested in food supplements, which is also really growing industry emerging alongside the fitness industry. So this is something also I'll be looking into in the near future.
Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
I think Ben has another comment or question.
Yeah, why don't I let Brenda go first?
Oh, I couldn't see. She's off my screen, but go ahead, Brenda. Yeah.
So thanks for such an interesting paper. I'm also paying attention to your work on building homes and concrete. And what kind of correspondence do you think there is between the kind of bodybuilding and other forms of kind of urban construction of self, construction of space, just either those threads of the materiality, but the kind of the shaping and the self fashioning. So could you speak to that, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for this question. So in a sense, what all this has in common is really a particular orientation towards the future, I think, right? And so this is why a lot of what I'm trying to do in my work is really think about the relationship between materiality and temporality. This is clear, I think, in how young people engage in domestic auto construction projects and the kind of engagement they have with building materials in a very kind of effective way, especially because of how drawn out these processes tend to be, right? But in a sense, all these kind of areas of interest of mine are really shaped by what's of the moment in Mozambique, right? So it's kind of following what people are most preoccupied with at a specific point in time when I'm busy designing research projects. And so what they have in common is, and the same goes with mobile phones. Like when I started my research on mobile phones, I had no intention of working on this topic. That it was what people were most concerned with at the time, right? And the same goes with the work I've done on building and cement and concrete. And now we're like moving to this other phase where it's not necessarily the same people, but it's what's in fashion at a specific historical juncture, right? But then beyond that, I think there's really a kind of a desire to engage with and imagine the future in a particular way. And then when it comes to fitness in particular, I think it's, and I've recently published on this, I think it's really quite perhaps tempting to simply dismiss, fitness as this just neoliberal thing that, of the self-improving subject and how boring this all is. But in reality, I think this would really quite not just overlook the longer histories of self-improvement, and building a house participates in these desires to be better, right? And then also how, and this is really what I'm committed to highlighting, is how transformative some of these practices are for people who engage in them, right? So how transformative it is for the women to start exercising. It really opens up these new spaces, these new opportunities, new social relations, new understandings of what they can actually achieve with their bodies, you know, that are actually really, really quite significant. And so in a way, what brings everything together is really that, it's this articulation between materiality and temporality.
Thanks.
Ben, you're on deck.
Yeah, so that was very interesting, that last response. And I want you to maybe put religion in the mix. Because, yeah, listening to you answer some of the questions, I'm thinking of other colleagues I have who work on sports or martial arts and the intersection with religion. And I wonder, you know, is that a factor with these networks of people who you know, is this something that's built into or built onto in the kinds of social relations that are formed in these new ways?
So yeah, that's also another really interesting question. And in a sense, I'm less familiar with the religious landscape in Maputo, just because I've been doing research there only, you know, sporadically over the years. But I'll say in the Inhambane context, firstly, the majority of the population identify as Catholic, right? Not everyone's Catholic, but it's like the leading religion in the city. And as you know, Ben, like Catholics are, you know, quite lucky to not have to do much about their faith, right? They, especially in this context, it's a really kind of the opposite of hands-on kind of religious affiliation. And so in a sense, there's been, you know, over the years, the young people that I've followed are, you know, maybe some of them switching to Pentecostal churches, but compared to other parts of even Mozambique, but certainly of the continent, Pentecostal churches play a really marginal role in the religious landscape in this town. So it's a very unusual place, as I was trying to highlight in you know, in my talk. And so in a sense, and I'm not saying that people are not religious, but the engagement with religion is almost very instrumental, if that's the right word, right? And so a lot of the kind of entertainment value of going to church and participating in, you know, church related groups and activities and celebrations and so on has not been entirely dismissed by you know, the growing popularity of fitness. And let's be clear, most people don't exercise, right? It's still a minority, right? But in a sense, there really is a kind of a parallel that it's, I mean, that people draw even between, you know, the kinds of opportunities in terms of networks, in terms of just entertainment and having something to do that the church provides, and that these more associative forms of fitness also provide, right? So I don't know if the parallel kind of is all that useful, but there is certainly a real important social dimension to the practices I was saying earlier, right? And so I don't know if this really fully answers your question, but again, this, I think my answer would be different in a different context, and it's really quite unique to, maybe not unique, but particular to Inhambane, this kind of religious landscape. And of course, there's also a large Muslim community in the city, less so in the region, but certainly in the city. You know, and I haven't been working with the Muslim community, so I can't say, you know, what part or what kind of articulations we're seeing between religion and exercising or fitness, right?
Okay, we probably have time for one, possibly two more questions or comments. If there's anybody still in the room who has a contribution, I'm looking for a hand. Joan, go ahead.
Sorry. It's such a, oops, I was going to say it's just such a really delightful topic. And Julie, I'm really appreciating all of your answers and investigations around these questions. So I was just putting together in my head part of Ben's questions about the, sort of religious piece, if there's any, and then just recalling that during COVID, the Jerusalem dance challenge sort of took off everywhere. It's great exercise. I do it a lot myself. Somebody else on this cast is also, I think we've been known to dance at about, 5 hours at a stretch. So I'm just wondering, again, because the dancers who made it really popular were Angolan. So there was sort of the, if you will, Portuguese colonial influence somewhere there. And I'm just wondering, are you seeing the sort of group that you're working with? Would they be folks that would be interested, be engaging in this sort of thing? Obviously, since dance is also a way of, engaging in the body and certainly sweating, maybe without the hierarchy that you were talking about before. I'm just wondering if you've either seen or heard, or if you've been in contact with folks during this long COVID time that have engaged in that as, a way of, once again, being in their bodies, because I'm sure a lot of things have changed for them during this tough time that we've all experienced.
Yeah, thank you. So if I think about the two main groups I was working with in Inhambane, first one, there were older women, right, in the 50s and 60s. I'm not entirely clear on their presence on social media, but I'm not Facebook friends with them, for example. And then the younger women I worked out with, they're kind of engaging, I would say, a lot more with some of these globally circulating trends and ideas, but at the same time they're still from relatively poor backgrounds, right? So they have limited means to some extent to really participate fully in these kind of broader networks or communities. But during COVID, so my really wonderful research assistant, who's Mozambican, based in Mozambique, she's doing her MA at the moment in anthropology. She was able to carry out research during the pandemic and try to get a sense of precisely some of the kinds of new ways of engaging with the world, engaging with the city and their bodies. And she, when I recruited her, she was not interested in fitness at all, and now she's become, through doing the project, a fitness, I don't know if enthusiast is the right word, but she certainly joined a group and is exercising now on, she told me, on a regular basis, and so it'll be interesting to see. I'm going back to Mozambique in December, and we'll be I think in a better position to try and get a sense of, I think a lot of things have changed since the last time I was there in March 2020, really. So I'll be in a better position then to really kind of assess what's going on. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question or comment if anyone has one. We do have one. Looks like Jamie, go ahead. I'm moving you over to panelist, so give it a second. And
hi. Sorry, I think this is my first time ever asking a question, and I didn't know it made you rejoin. Hi, Julia. I had a quick question about something that you said earlier, which had to do with sort of your earlier research and how it is compared to the work you're doing now. So you mentioned that people are rather skeptical about receiving information, but with fitness, for whatever reason, that skepticism sort of goes away. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit about what it is about fitness that sort of, I don't know, makes people suspend their disbelief.
Yeah, I wonder really. I'm still trying to make sense of this. In a sense, I think it's part of the answer probably has to do with the kind of formal training that is assumed to back the information. So the credentials of the trainers and then the instructors and so on. So I think that would play a part. I haven't really compared this lack of skepticism that I find in fitness centers, for example, to other, say, more formal educational settings. Like do we find that the same kind of deference, if that's the right word, to information in the school system? And I'd be tempted to kind of venture that to some extent, probably, right? So there's that. There's also the kind of idea, and this is a paper I'm working on at the moment, but there's also the idea that information, or fitness information in particular, right, is assessed in a relational fashion. So there's this respect for the instructor, but then when it comes to, say, working with a personal trainer, then the quality of the training, and I would describe this also as the quality of the information provided, or on which the training rests, will be assessed according to the results, right? And so on several occasions I met gym goers who had things to say about their personal trainer that were really based on how the relationship hadn't been successful, right? So it wasn't a kind of dismissing the quality of a particular trainer, or suggesting that they were just not very good trainers, but it was really a kind of assessment of the relationship, or of the information in a relational fashion, right? So a recognition that the information had to be located in a particular relationship, right? And in a sense, it's almost as if there is a really kind of embodied dimension to this assessment and to this evaluation, right? Rather than a kind of downright critique of the capabilities of the individual trainer. And so that would make it specific to fitness information, right? It wouldn't apply in another kind of context, say at school or university or whatever.
Thanks, Julie. Well, I think we're at the end of our session